Hi everybody, Tia Kansara here. We're going to go live with Merlin Sheldrake today. Merlin is a biologist and a best-selling author of a more recent book, actually, that we're going to be discussing, The Entangled Life, How Fungi Make Our Worlds, Change Our Minds, Shape Our Futures. And I'm really quite excited because from reading the book, I've just been really engrossed in a world which I don't really inhabit. Merlin received his Ph.D. in tropical ecology from Cambridge University for his work on underground fungal networks in tropical forests in Panama, where he was a predoctoral research fellow of the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute. And I think his sort of sensitivity in this field has been really intriguing. And when I reached out, he was very gracious in accepting my invitation. So Merlin, welcome to Replenish Earth Live. I'm very excited to have you. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
So whereabouts are you at the moment?
I'm in London.
Oh, nice. And how have you been spending your COVID period?
In lockdown and a lot of book promotion, but all on Zoom. So it's been actually it's been quite possible to do the promotion. Just a lot of Zooming.
A lot of Zooming. It's so fascinating because for me, reading the book is a kind of a dip into a world that I don't often explore. It's sort of like the underlayer of what's happening. And I think you sort of beautifully put it, that biology is sort of the study of an organism, ecology, the relationship between. And it's almost as if mycology is this sort of the meta layer of some level of multidimensionality that we don't normally or often get to explore. So thank you for writing the book, because it's going to be delightful to read. I really recommend it. I mean, I wouldn't say that lightly. I've got thousands of books, of course. I'm a bit of a bibliophile. But the one thing that I really enjoyed about your book was your personal narrative as you explore both the research element of your work as well as the experiences that you have. And I think this subjective experience that has led this curiosity in you to write this book is really fascinating. So one of the things that we were sort of exploring in the lead up to this live was how we're kind of already like fungi. It was so bizarre reading. I'm just going to sort of, if I may, quote a few parts of the book, which I really found really fascinating, where we're talking about just the level at which we interact with fungi without realizing it, how much of our lives is dependent on it, how much of our medical industry is dependent on it, how much of our health is dependent on it, internally, externally, this relationship between and through different forms of fungi as well, like the percentage of the fungi that we don't even know. I mean, we've really uncovered such little of it. It's almost as if we're really at the beginning stages. And as you sort of jest, we don't really have a department of, the study of fungi yet, although I can almost imagine you sort of leading that. But there was this really beautiful piece that I wanted to sort of read out, which was like, we often don't connect with fungi in the way and the mannerisms in which we've evolved and developed as humans. And it's almost as if, and you quote this in your book, that it's because of the fungi that the plant were sort of introduced on land. And it's almost as if the growth of this fungus it predates our growth on land, but it also, without it, we wouldn't be either. And without it, we would cease to exist. So it's, we are because of the fungi, but we're also so intricately dependent on it that it's impossible to know our lives without it, despite our lack of knowledge of that one little fact. So tell us, how are we dependent on fungus?
There are so many ways. We'd be here for a long time if I listed them all. But every part of the biosphere as we know it is supported by fungal life. Whether it be in plant growth, fungi support the growth of plants, they support the ongoing health of plants. They also can be big diseases of plants that affect our lives in very major ways. So in the sense that plants are at the base of the food chains that sustain all life on land, including our own, and fungi are key parts of that base of the food chain that sustains all life on land, including our own, we would not be here on any level were it not for this fungal activity. Of course, fungi have played a huge role in the evolution of plants as well. It's not just plants today, it's the whole story of land plants evolving from water-dwelling algae washing up onto the soggy shores of lakes and rivers 500 million years ago. So this is just one way. Then their role as decomposing organisms. If they didn't decompose the bodies of animals and plants, the earth would be piled kilometers deep in these bodies. And so it's what you said, we notice fungi almost by the space they leave behind. And there's these big seams of unrotted forest that became coal. Those were unrotted because they escaped fungal reach. They were buried in anoxic swamps where fungi could not follow. And so we see there how much fungi were not able to do. The coal is this sort of negative of fungal histories. And that's normally what happens. And we notice fungi when they stop doing what they do because we take it for granted that they do what they do. So there are so many. I mean, in human life, there is drugs, as foods, as medicines, and as all sorts of various tools of fire. Carrying fire, coals. There's so many examples. It's a dizzying question.
Yeah, like not to mention the spores. You mentioned that spores are found in clouds and influence the weather by triggering the formation of the water droplets that form rain. It's so intricate. It's so intimate with our lives. It's there was another piece that you mentioned. Sorry, I'm just going to be quoting parts of the book, but there's this sort of I think it's called cyclosporine. Sorry if I haven't pronounced it well. Which my sister-in-law, who's a surgeon, would love to know. It comes from fungus, immunosuppressant drug that makes organ transplants possible. Cholesterol-lowering statins, a host of powerful antiviral and anti-cancer compounds, including, as you say, the multi-billion-dollar drug Taxol. It's almost as if it's so intricate. It's our relationship with nature and uncovering nature, even though we do sort of isolate it, that has sort of made us able-bodied, right? Like the invention of I wouldn't even call it it's sort of like the exploration of penicillin, for example, found already almost, as you call it, the molds in the Neanderthal sort of adventure. So it's almost as if it's been so present in our lives, and yet it feels as if we as humans feel that we're sort of like head of the kingdom, but I'm not too sure whether we'd even exist without it. So could you tell us a little bit more about the dependence on fungus? I mean, if we died, the planet would continue. But if all of mycology died, then goodbye humans.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not a two-way street in that sense. We are dependent totally on fungal lives, as we are also on plant lives and bacterial lives. But so if you wiped all the humans off the face of the planet in a single instant, you've wiped all of the fungi off the planet in a single instant, then we would no longer be able to exist. If you wiped all the bacteria and plants off the planet as well, we would no longer be able to exist. But if you wiped the humans off the planet, they would all be able to exist perfectly fine. So there's we like to think of ourselves as important, and to ourselves we are important. But perhaps we're less important in the big picture of things than we like to think.
There was this piece on sort of radiation, nuclear disasters and explosions in Chernobyl that you mentioned, and it, in terms of maybe even the use, because we have a lot of these still in commission nuclear power plants. In 2011, when the Japanese Fukushima blast had occurred, it scared a lot of us because we use, the nuclear power as a baseload across the world. Just because Germany and the UK are sort of decommissioning their plants, it doesn't mean that we're not still dependent on the French capability of this nuclear power. And yet, when we think in terms of fungi, we don't think that fungi could almost save us from radiation poisoning, or that it could in some way help us to protect our environment where there is a lot of radiation. And actually, what's really fascinating is the growth of mushrooms quite close to, electric smog. So if you're getting a lot of electric radiation or radiation in general, you get a lot of growth of this fungus or fungi. So it's almost as if it's a telling sign, just like the exploration of truffles in your little adventures that you were going. The sort of, you're exploring, but the fungus is almost a living organism underneath. Aside from the sort of the mycelial connections that have been formed, like this incredible, wood wide web that I believe it's A Hidden Life of Trees, mentions this sort of like mycelial network. And I suppose what's really happening is this behind the scenes. It feels very much behind the scenes of what we've been able to see. But in your explorations, and I note you sort of like almost picking out the pieces of the roots of plants to get to the fungus, to understand these connections. What have you found out about the sort of the nature and the connections between these plants, or the mycelial network that exists underground?
There's a lot there. It's when you look under a microscope, when you put roots under a microscope and you look at the fungi living within them and living on them and stringing off them into the surrounding space, it's just striking how intimate this relationship is. It's actually hard to imagine. I found it hard to imagine a more intimate set of poses. They clasp each other. They're very much a prosthetic organ of each other's body. And Lynn Margulis, the great biologist, and the great advocate of a symbiotic way of life, she talks about the story of life as one of the history of the long-lasting intimacy of strangers. And so when you look at these plants and fungi intertwining, you really see this intimacy, this long-lasting intimacy of strangers. In fact, so much so that they're no longer strangers, and it's hundreds of millions of years old, this relationship. And so it's very hard to ignore the fact that life is made up of these daring leaps across species boundaries, across kingdom boundaries. That these root relationships with fungi is just a particularly easy place to see that. But actually, this is a story across the whole of the living world. And we have bacteria that live within us, without which we wouldn't be able to do as we do. Big bacteria can have small bacteria living within them, and bacteria and fungi have viruses living within them, and large viruses have small viruses living within them. And so we have it's just nested relationships all the way down. And fungi, because they form these physical connections between organisms, particularly between plants, as you say, they embody this basic principle of ecology. They make it impossible for us to ignore these intricate relationships that form between organisms, which we might otherwise pass over or make invisible. So they're they're kind of iconic, connective organisms that can lead us out of our stories of neat individuals bounded in isolated bodies.
Reminds me of something, that I think a lot of people are exploring their relationship with nature, given this almost forced cocoon experience in the metamorphosis, I suppose, that the pandemic has, pushed on top of us, and being at home grounded, and a very introvert experience, or very sort of introspective experience of the pandemic, and being locked down is almost as if we're going into our own chrysalis and into our own metamorphosis and into our own, almost like the mirror through which we're now seeing life as systems break down or are unable to work around either the pandemic or what's happening in terms of the support systems and structures, the political systems, the decision making based on what and how, that we have started to question, because it may or may not be able to continue the way that it has. So it's almost as if there is this reimagining, this emerging of new, this exploration, this, wow, that 1 hour that I'm allowed to go outside for a walk, I'm going to make the most of it. And, a lot of us have spent our youth and, growing up in cities and concrete jungles, kind of like London, in ways that we never could have imagined any other way. So we're so climatized, like we've become humans that live in boxes. We, coming from the background of the design of cities, the building of architecture, the design of these environments for us, we've almost lost touch with the wild. What is wild nature? Not, a square piece of land. I'm right here in Primrose Hill, a piece of land with, a layer of grass on top of it, with trees lining, the pathways. Where is there an opportunity during this time that we can explore a reconnection with nature? And how do we even facilitate that? Because this is almost as if the pandemic and this time, this introversion is calling for. How do we even begin? If previously our relationship with nature is boxed up or containable, or in a square or a rectangular piece of lawn, where do we even begin?
So there are a few ways, I guess. There is, I think any kind of journey like this has to begin in curiosity. So how do we awaken our curiosity about the more than human world? How do we find a way in to our interest in what's happening outside us? Once we find that place, and that might be different for everyone, then we can slide down the helter-skelter of fascination. But until we get there, we're going to have a hard time. And so that is going to be different for everyone. They'll have to approach this in a way which is meaningful for them. And I think part of the thing we need to do is to reevaluate some of the tired dualities that shape our thoughts. So nature and culture, for example, and to think about the more than human world, the living world, as one which involves humans. And we are part of this world. And so rather than think of our world, the world of human culture, as a totally separate domain from that of the world of nature, and to look for wild nature as some kind of ideal, which we're never really going to find, at least most of us are not going to encounter in our lives, given the long arm of human influence. That to think about the living world, to think about ourselves as being embedded in the living world, and to try and find the places where we can feel our connection to the living world, or where that's become so apparent to us that we can no longer ignore it. And so the pandemic is an example of where there's a virus which actually many don't think of as being alive, but many do at the same time. It's a disputed question in biology. But these organisms, these entities, inhabit this kind of gray zone between life and non-life. But nonetheless, this entity has interposed itself between us and our human ambitions. And in doing so, has forced us to reckon with the fact that we are not as in control as we thought. And so that interruption does provide us with an opportunity to reconsider some of the narratives that we were telling about power, about our importance, about our ability to be in control. And so, yeah, I think this is a moment of opportunity for us to do some reimagining, and I think reimagining is something that needs to happen, virus or no virus. But there'll be more viruses, and so yes, the main thing for me is to think about these tired stories, these tired dualities, these things which are these narratives which lead us into isolation from each other and from the more than human world, and to try and re-examine those, to dissolve those, to compost those, and to find ways of opening connection. And that can be imaginative, that can be with physical contact, if you're gardening, if you're just sticking your hands in the soil. If when you eat a plant, you think about where those plants come from. There are so many ways. They can sound trite on their own, but it adds up.
Yeah, it really does. And it sort of gives you the opportunity to almost like seek within this exploration of the self in connection with nature, in relation with nature. And one of the things I was thinking about was how we've separated ourselves, that we're separate, we're individual, where we almost identify ourselves as I am an individual, I am an individual event. But even in the words of Alan Watts, where did you begin as the individual? Because to be individual, you need to be an event that has start and end date, right? But did you start when you were born, or did you start when you were conceived, or did you start it kind of, if all of these the string of events hadn't occurred, then you wouldn't be, and you can't be this independent individual isolation. So if we're not separate, but we've brought ourselves to think that we are, we've educated ourselves to be separate-bodied, separate humans. Where is that awakening? Where does one arise from? Like in thermodynamics, or the thermal comfort work that I used to do inside buildings, I often used to question people, where does your body end? Because a lot of the heat that dissipates into the environment becomes the environment. The air that comes out of your breath becomes the environment. The relationship between the environment and me is symbiotic. What are some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I think it's really important to think about how we conceive of the world. So you can think about the universe as being made up of things, and if you boil it down, you get to atoms, which are very tiny things. And this is a substance view, a view of the universe as being made up of substances. And these substances are persistent, enduring stuff. And so this is a view that's been around for a while. And there's another view, which is to think about the universe as being made up of processes rather than substances. And so processes, that as you said, that we are these processes, that our body, the cells that make you up today are different cells from the cells which made you up a few years ago. And so what are you if not the stuff which makes you up? Same with, say, when you're talking about a frog. At what point in the life cycle of the frog are we talking about? Egg, tadpole, froglet, frog, or back to tadpole, and so back to egg. So, and so if you actually look at bubble it down to the smallest level, atoms are no longer considered to be little items, little micro entities, enduring things like little billiard balls as they were in the 19th century. And then now waves of stability within quantum fields. These are processes. These are stabilized processes. And so when we start to think about ourselves as these processes, as stabilized processes, as sort of standing waves of stability in endless change, then I think it's easier to loosen the grip of this narrative of us as being neatly identified individuals, because the boundaries of ourselves are more fluid, more porous. This is not new age idea, it's just physical reality, as you said. We're constantly in biophysical flux with our surroundings, whether it be heat or gas, food, water. We're in constant flux in exchange with our surroundings. And the composition of our bodies is determined by our surroundings, and the workings of our mind is determined by the way that we interrelate with other humans and the other organisms that surround us. And so we're porous beings. And once we see ourselves as porous beings, it becomes harder to justify environmental exploitation, because if we are made up of our environment and depend entirely on our environment to go about our daily lives, our healthy daily lives, then how could it be rational to pump poisons into our environment, into our water, into our air? At what point can you justify that behavior if that water and that air is then going to go into our bodies? And so I think this kind of way of thinking is helpful and could help us to destabilize these irrational and destructive behaviors.
Thinking in terms of climate crises, this week is Climate Week New York, and one of our key invitations this week to all of our listeners and our audience is to question very, very simply, these relationships. And this is the reason why I believe this interview with Merlin is really important and timely, and your book is so timely, that we often don't think about the sort of biological facts that are invited into this space, as you spoke eloquently about just now, that we are, because of the environment that is and this relationship that we have with it, so much so that if anything it starts to degrade, we are in fact also degrading ourselves, that we are also affecting ourselves, that we also have the opportunity of not being around. And we have this it's almost like that we totally believe that the planet is going to evaporate from the climate crisis. The climate's most probably not going to evaporate. It's the existential crisis that humans have, that we've anthropomorphized that on the planet, that we almost assume that just because we are at the potential of not being around, that that the planet's going to somehow sort of evaporate, not be in existence. And I think it's some of the words that you use of being able to put things into context, into the culture of the now. It's identifying who we are, but also in the grand process and or system of life on planet Earth. So there's this sort of the new age woo-woo aspect versus the kind of biological facts that are emerging. And it's interesting, when I was reading your book, it's almost as if science is moving forward, like all of the scientific sort of explorations and the things that we used to believe 20 years ago have sort of we've moved on. And it's the integration of these learnings that allows us to move our own minds towards the current dilemmas and the questions and the curiosity that are emerging today. How can we be more aligned with what's emerging? It feels so overwhelming to learn about these things. How can we almost take it, as you said, step by step, by putting our hands into the earth and sort of sensing and feeling our environment, and giving ourselves this opportunity to, yes, use the science as well as the experiences that we have?
Again, it's a huge question, and the answer will be different for everybody. But I think if we think about it in principles, as schematically, then it seems that we need to find ways both to connect and find ways to compost or dissolve those things which stop us connecting with other humans, or connecting with the living world more generally. And so in my own life, I do what I can to feed my sense of connection with the world outside me, and I do my best to block, to resist, to divert those forces which disconnect me. And there are a lot of forces that disconnect us, that are designed to disconnect us, which are designed with huge investment and a lot of intelligent people trying to disconnect us. And so it's very hard to resist those forces. But I think that we're going to have to find ways to do so. I can't really, I can't speak more generally than that, but it's a two-pronged approach.
I was quite curious about your the experiments with LSD and or psilocybin and the moth that was licking the flower that had the qualities. I think it's on page 111 if anyone's curious. How do you feel this other world that exists through, whether it is mind alteration or mental health, how can we sort of begin to explore the journeys that we can have and the learnings that we can have through these psychedelic journeys with fungus?
Well, in the clinical study I describe in the book, where I took LSD in a hospital, and it was an interesting experience for me because I realized that my mind was a much larger process than I had realized, and that the parts of my mind that I normally spend time in are just a very small part, that there are much larger expanses of my mind to explore. And that was really, that was an exciting feeling, and a feeling that persisted after the experience had stopped. It was a realization that endures. So for me, that's one of the important aspects of the psychedelic avenues. Of course, these aren't for everybody, and but I think they can be, in the right circumstances and done responsibly and carefully, can be helpful for many people, though not maybe all. But for me, they are a way of connecting. It's a way of, and this is what the recent research has been suggesting, that the way they work on a brain level is that they disable a kind of reducing valve in our consciousness, a reducing valve that restricts our experience to make it more manageable, to allow us to accomplish everyday tasks like chores or doing our taxes, or that we're not bombarded by overwhelming experience all the time, that we need this kind of reducing valve. But the reducing valve is a kind of obstacle that's set up between to shutter off much of the potential experience that we could be having. And so the psychedelics seem to work by disabling that, by removing a blockage, or by removing a kind of restricting valve. And so I see so they can help us to connect, and to connect with these different parts of our mind, and if you see these maps of the brain activity for different parts of our brain, to connect with each other. So these are, I see the psychedelic story as part of this story about connection and disconnection, to continue speaking in these general terms. It's interesting, as you say, that we see intoxication all across the animal world, and there are lots of really
really fascinating. I mean, I would never have thought that a moth would be licking a flower to have these almost intoxicated experiences. I mean, one doesn't really know what the moth is actually experiencing, but I'd be so curious to find out the relationship that the natural world has with itself, and whether it is the enticing exploration. I think these sorts of plant medicines have been prevalent, whether it's a soma of India to the ayahuasca of Latin America and the Brazilian sort of tribes, and connections with the indigenous lands in, say, Uluru in Australia. There is this connection that is created for thousands of years. Like if you were to take the Arawaka tribe in Sierra Nevada in Colombia, the mamo has something close to 16,000 different species that they use to integrate and to help their communities to prevent, like a preventative measure for health. It's fascinating that as we're exploring your work, we're almost uncovering something that, like opening the lid of something that really has been hidden for a while. And I can only imagine that this has led to even more questions for you. Whilst writing the book, what do you feel, what's kind of coming up for you as questions that, and I loved that you said, I've been trying my best not to sort of box in and not to kind of like be reductionist and not, and to try and keep these open questions. Where do you lie with them now?
Well, I've tried to keep them open, and so when a question is an open question, then it can lead us into new places. As soon as we answer the question, we've killed the question.
Right,
and a new question. All right, so it's quite nice to have questions that we don't actually, or be unable to answer, that will draw us forward into ever deepening curiosity and exploration. And so with the book, there are a few of these questions. Like, what happens when we take the concept of the individual and we make it into a question rather than an answer known in advance? At what point do I start and stop? At what point does this organism start and stop? And what do I mean by start and stop anyway? And this is a big one for me, the individual one, and it really changes the way that I experience my daily life. When I see all organisms as these nested relationships, when I see my body as a series of nested relationships, I think this can really change the way that we experience the world and the way that we form relationships with the living world and with other humans. And so that's a big one. Then how are we like fungi, and how are we unlike fungi, and how can we be more like fungi? These are big ones for me, and these have always been big ones for me, thinking about the fungal world and spending time imagining the lives of these organisms and trying to understand them. And so this is I don't think we can have neat answers to these questions, but those really drove for me the writing of this book, which is trying to explore the possibilities of fungal life and to explore our ability to understand the possibilities of fungal life. And so these also remain big ones for me.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for sharing those. And I think that there is, I think there's a really, really important and deep exploration, I think that's, for me, that's happening right now. And that is that, apart from the age-old questions of who am I, why am I here, where did I come from, where am I going, the purpose of my life, etc., it's almost as if I'm even more inquisitive about nature, the awe that I feel when I'm in wild nature, the experience of sitting next to, a 4,000-year-old tree last week as I was quite close to Windsor. So I went to visit a tree where the Magna Carta was signed, and previously, there's all this life that has this history integrated into it, and it's almost as if I'm so curious. I want to find out. I want to be like maybe the third brain that Carl Jung sort of taps into, meditate and do the kind of shamanic work or the personal transformation work that can help me transition from me identifying only as ego to me and this body, to me going beyond what is the ego and this body to that which exists out of me as well. So it's as if the environment is giving me an opportunity to see who I am. And the more I explore the environment, like I can only imagine, as you said, you were in Panama doing your research and sort of, finding this flower, for example, that doesn't survive on, the chlorophyll photosynthesis that we would expect plants to survive on, and yet has this relationship, almost like this understanding between that we can explore. And there's a beautiful Michael Jackson quote that I use to kind of almost like meditate on, and it reminds me that there is this inspiration that comes from something that then creates curiosity. Sometimes I'm able to catch it, like Elizabeth Gilbert talks about in a lot of her TED Talks, the author of Eat, Pray, Love, Signature of All Things. And it's sort of like if I caught it then, brilliant, I'll bring it into being. Like it's almost as if I caught it there and I brought it into being. And I feel for me, this is where your book is, where there was this sort of inspiration that you had. You caught it, you brought it in, you wrote about it. I've never really asked you any questions on your spiritual practice or your relationship with the greater being, but I'm quite curious about it. Would you feel comfortable sharing?
Yeah, there are a number of ways which I connect, and physical activity is one. Cold water is another. When I was small, when I was 2, I used to have terrible tantrums, and the only way that I would be encouraged to be quiet was to be sprayed with cold water.
Was that
and it's
Jill?
given me something. That's my dad, yeah. And then family friends thought that they'd give me a phobia of cold water, but actually I've got a deep love of cold water. So cold water is a way that really helps me to fall out of my mind and into my senses. In fact, anything that helps me fall out of my mind and into my senses helps me to connect. And music is a big one for me. Spending time outside. Yeah, there are a whole load.
Beautiful. Well, look, Merlin, an absolute pleasure to have you on our show, and I'm so grateful that our audience will have the opportunity to ask you, I'm sure, a lot of questions. And also, I really recommend, I don't really do this very frequently, but I really recommend people reading Merlin's book. For me, it's I picked it up and I couldn't stop reading because there was so much of what you were saying that really felt as if I was going on this adventure with you. And it was very personal for me as well. These sort of questions you ask are very big questions, as you say. By answering them, so I really do hope that you continue to ask these very big questions and help us to ask these very big questions. I'm going to share your link on your website so that people can explore your work even further, and wish you an incredible, incredible journey with launching the book. Merlin, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me, Tia. It's been great to be here.
Thanks, everybody.